I was going into town this week, and I was driving in. I had the radio on, and I was listening to a sports talk radio show. And the hosts of the show were talking about the Super Bowl, which had happened 2 weeks ago. And what was interesting, they were not talking about the football game themselves. Apparently, one of the guys had gotten to go. The radio station sent him to the Super Bowl, and he got to go. And what he was talking about was how expensive everything was. And he wasn't talking just about the expense that would come with going out there for that, getting the airline tickets and then getting there and getting a hotel and then paying the outrageous prices for the game tickets. What he was talking about and kind of complaining about was what was going on once he got into the stadium. And what he said was that the concession prices were just outrageous. He got thirsty and wanted to get a bottle of water, and it was $7. Now, I bought a case of water the other day, 24, and I got the bonus pack that had 4 extras in it, 28 bottles for $3.98. Do the math, that's a little over 14 cents a bottle for the same thing that they were charging $7 for at the Super Bowl. Now, I do understand this is not the official water of the Super Bowl, or of the NFL, but you get the point. Why do you think it costs $7? Well, I think everybody knows. In fact, I would imagine several of you have been in a situation like that before. You've been somewhere or someplace where you don't really have an option if you want to purchase something. You have this picture in your mind of that going down the highway and you see the last chance for gas for the next 100 miles and they've jacked the price up. You've been somewhere where there's only one place to get something and they know that and they charge more for it. Maybe you've had this happen. Years ago, our son was little. Christmas Day, one of the things that we bought him required a certain kind of battery that I didn't have. And so after we were done with unwrapping all the presents and doing all that, I went up to the only store in town that was open. Was a 7-Eleven convenience store. And I went in there and I said, oh, they'll have batteries. So I walked up and I was stunned by how much they wanted for the batteries. Of course, I bought them anyway because it was Christmas morning and I didn't want him to be disappointed. And I took them home and we did that. I could have saved a lot of money if I'd waited till the day after Christmas, but they had me. In economic terms, it's what's called a captive market. And that condition occurs when you're forced to buy something because there is no other option. In other words, you have to use a particular vendor because there are no other options. The people at the Super Bowl who got thirsty had to pay $7 for a bottle of water. A soft drink was the same price. And I went and looked, and they had it. The stuff's already expensive at games like that. When the Super Bowl came in, they raised the price on everything even more because they knew they had the people. It reminded me, a few years ago, there was a story about one of the hurricanes that hit the Gulf Coast. And there was a story on one of the news networks about it was a building supply company that had stocked up on plywood because they knew the storm was coming, and then they jacked the price of it way up because they knew everybody would be needing it, and they were going to be the only ones that had it. After everyone else was sold out, they had more, and they raised the price. It's called price gouging. Now, there are certain laws against that, but, it's still goes on sometimes. There's restrictions against it, but it still happens. And I'm sure that many of you have found yourself in that situation where you don't really have an option for something. Now, there's nothing wrong with making an economic profit. In fact, no one goes into business to lose money. I mean, that's not the point of having a business. But there is a large difference between the economic profit, the profit that you make engaging in business, and taking advantage of somebody in their situation. It's not something new. It's not something that happens just in our capitalistic society, even though our system allows for things like that. It's been going on for a long time. It happened all the way back in Jesus' day as well. As we continue in our study on the life of Christ this morning, we're looking at the events that happened in Jesus' life, the things that he said, the teachings that he gave, to learn how we might more live like him and to take the points that he makes and take those and apply them to our lives. And we're going to see this morning that Jesus encounters a situation like this, and he's not pleased about it. Last week we saw his first miracle when he changed water into wine. This morning we're going to visit the next recorded event in Jesus' life when he visits the temple in Jerusalem. We'll be in John chapter 2 this morning, and we're going to begin in verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Jesus was an obedient Jewish man. He was obedient to do the things, the customs, the traditions, and most importantly, the things that his religion, that his faith commanded him to do. The time of Passover had gotten near, and so Jesus, it says, he went up to Jerusalem to celebrate. When we last saw him, he was in Cana, which was in the area of Galilee, which is north of Jerusalem. It's several days' journey by foot. And when you keep that in mind as we look at this story, that plays into it a little bit. It's a several days' journey. And it says that he went up to Jerusalem. When we see that, remember, Jerusalem sat up on a hill. So whenever we see in Scripture someone went up to Jerusalem, we don't think of it as we would looking at a map, not directional. They went up in elevation. He made the climb up the hill into Jerusalem. And when he arrives at the temple, he encounters a strange sight. The outer area of the temple, there was an area that was known as the Court of the Gentiles. And it had been transformed into a big marketplace. There were a variety of animals for sale right there. We see there it says there were oxen and sheep and doves. Variety of different animals that were for sale. It was the area that this is occurring in, the Court of the Gentiles, was a large open space in front of the temple itself. It was called the Court of the Gentiles because the people who were Gentiles, non-Jews, that was the area that they would come to. They could not come into the temple. That was reserved for the people of the Jewish faith. But they had area outside in that it was a big, wide, open area, several acres probably. They were restricted to that court. They could come there. They could worship if they wanted to. They could come visit. They could do those things, but they couldn't come in. They had to stay outside. And when Jesus gets there, he sees all this variety of animals for sale. And that's understandable. If you'll remember the sacrificial system that the Jewish folks lived under at that time, there were certain laws that said if you are bringing a sacrifice for this particular thing, you need to bring this particular kind of animal. There were all kinds of different sacrifices. There were ones for sin, for trespass, there were fellowship offerings, there were peace offerings. Each one required different animals or different conditions to bring the offering. The people who were coming to celebrate the Passover would want to come and to make an offering to take care of stuff in their life, to clean up their lives, to, if there was sin that needed to be taken care of, they would bring the sin offering. They wanted to get everything squared away before the Passover began. So they would be what's called ceremonially clean. They want to get everything taken care of. And along with the different types of animals, for the different kinds of offerings, there were certain requirements for the conditions of the animals. They had to be a certain age, they had to be a certain condition. A lot of times it would say without blemish, things like that. There was prescriptions for the quantity, there was also prescriptions for the quality. So let's try and put ourselves in their shoes for a few minutes. You live several days away on foot, and you have to travel on foot, and you're getting ready to go up to Jerusalem to participate in the Passover. And you know that when you get there, you're going to have to bring an animal or have an animal to provide for, let's say, your sin offering. So you need to bring a particular kind of animal. You have two choices. You can bring one from home, take them on this long journey, and if you'll remember, back then, because they traveled on foot and they went through some very remote and wilderness kinds of areas, it wasn't always a safe journey. There were animals, there were wild animals, there were predator animals, there were robbers that lived there and took advantage of the people who would steal things from them. So you could bring your own animal, or if you had the financial means, maybe you would just bring the money and wait until you got to Jerusalem and bought something. If you brought your own animal as well, remember it had to be acceptable. So if you brought this animal along, something happened to it on the way, you get all the way there, you're ready to make your sacrifice, and they deem your animal unacceptable, what are you going to do? You're stuck. Well, in steps the first century businessman, and that's who we encounter right here. He'll be glad to sell you an animal. He might even take your animal that you brought as part of your payment, and he's going to make sure that the animal that he sells you is acceptable to the priest because he's all part of the same group. It was a very lucrative business. There was one vendor. You didn't have anywhere else to go. You couldn't go back home and get another one. You didn't have time. They had you. You were like that fan at the stadium that gets thirsty. You want a drink, you're going to pay, or you're going to go thirsty. And they had the people. And the people paid the price, even if it was steep. They were taken advantage of. The second kind of people Jesus saw there, says, were money changers seated at their tables. According to Exodus chapter 30, everyone owed a temple tax once a year. It was a half a shekel, which wasn't a tremendous amount of money, but everyone of age in Israel owed that to the temple. Here's the catch. There were all kinds of different forms of money throughout the ancient Near East. Every area, every region had their own kind of coins. They had different things. They made them. They had different people's faces on them. Some were small, some large. It varied from place to place. Well, the people that came in were coming from all over the area, so they would have all kinds of different types of money. There was only one coin that was accepted by the priest to pay the temple tax. It was a coin that was made in the area of Tyre, and the reason they accepted it was it had the highest silver content. So no matter how much money you brought, if you did not have that particular kind of coin in that particular denomination, you could not pay your temple tax. They would only accept one kind of coin. And that's where the money changers came in. They would gladly take your coin from another area and exchange it for the correct coin, the acceptable coin. And they'd be glad to do that for a price, for a transaction fee, for a percentage. It wasn't dollar for dollar. You lost because they had you. They contained, if you got there and didn't have the right coin, you had nowhere else to go. They set fees on their transactions, and you couldn't go down to the store and get change. You were stuck. They had you in a captive place. You didn't have anywhere else to turn, and so they began to charge excessive fees and exchange rates. So both the animal vendors and the money changers performed an important task. What they are doing, the task they are performing, is not what's at issue. It was the fact they were taking advantage of the people because they had a captive audience. Many of the people who came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover were what we know as just good, hardworking, honest, humble people. And it was a big deal for them to get to the big city and to come and to be able to worship, and then wham, they get hit with this. They hadn't planned on that. They were getting taken advantage of. Jesus will show us throughout his earthly ministry that he doesn't tolerate that. He has a heart for the downtrodden. He has a heart for the marginalized. He has a heart for those who've kind of been left behind. He has a heart for those who've been taken advantage of. We'll see that he has a heart for people who are ostracized because of an illness or because they were women. Jesus has a heart to lift up those who are in a less fortunate situation. So when he gets to the temple, two things are wrong with the picture he sees. First, the area that had been reserved for the Gentiles and was allowed for them to come and to congregate and to even worship is full of a bunch of animals. You know what that meant. There were all the things that went with the animals or that were left by the animals. All of that stuff was there. All kinds of noise, all kinds of confusion and activity. That's not very conducive to worship, is it? And secondly, the ones running the market were preying on the people who had no alternative, the ones who found themselves part of this captive audience. And that's a situation Jesus finds, and he doesn't like it, so he does something about it. Verse 15 says, he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Jesus did a little house cleaning. It says he made a scourge. A scourge was a whip. He found some rope. He fashioned some type of a whip. And as we look at this, we see he used it to drive them out. He didn't go around and start whipping the people. It's more like a thing of using it to shoo the people out and the animals out, chase them out. He overturned the tables. He said, get out of here. Now, the incident has been portrayed many times, and many of you have seen it in a movie, and how violent it is and how vicious and how angry they might portray Jesus is simply done to whoever's making the movie what their interpretation of it is. What happened is his point was to scatter the people, to remove them from the area because what they were doing was wrong. So he chased them away, and in the midst of doing that, he tells them why. Verse 16, and to those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus is upset because of what they have done to what he says is my Father's house. The temple represented God's presence on earth. It was the one place where people would go to sacrifice and worship and draw closer to God. And the environment for doing that has been changed dramatically. It was a marketplace. It wasn't what it was supposed to be. The temple was not being used for what God had ordained it was to be used for. Instead of being a place for everyone to come and draw closer to Him, it had become a place where the strong were taking advantage of the weak. The haves were kind of taking advantage of the have-nots. And that's something Jesus didn't tolerate. Made His Father's house a place of business. And the temple wasn't designed for that. Listen to these words. It's from Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 56, even those I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all the peoples. And God's house has become something different. Do you remember the story when Jesus was young? He was 12 years old, and the family had gone up to Jerusalem to celebrate. Remember, they traveled in a big group, and they got done celebrating one of the feasts, and they loaded up and they headed back home. And they travel all day long, and Mary must think Jesus is with his dad, and Joseph thinks he must be either with the group of kids or back with Mary. So they get a day away from Jerusalem. They get ready to make camp, and Jesus is missing. Well, they're alarmed, as any parent would be. They're a day away, so it takes them another day to get back to Jerusalem, and then they have to hunt for him. And when they do, they find him, and he's in the temple. Remember, he had stayed in the temple. But do you remember what he said to him? He said, why is it you're looking for me? You know, he had more important things to attend to. He said, did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house? Jesus has an incredible desire to do the will of the Father, to do the important things. And now he sees the place that that's supposed to happen. The representation of that on earth has been changed and made into something that it wasn't supposed to be. The quote in verse 17 there is from Psalm 69. And it gives us a picture of the passion that Jesus had to do the Father's work. It shows us his character. The Messiah is the one who will come and will set the wrong things right. When he sees the temple being misused, he does something about it. He doesn't worry about making these guys upset. He doesn't worry about making the businessmen mad. He doesn't worry about the inconvenience it may cause for some. He's doing and setting what's wrong right. They have perverted the function of the temple, of the place of worship, both for the Jews and the Gentiles. And he's setting things straight. Wouldn't it be great if we, as those who call ourselves followers of him, had that same zeal to follow the Father's will, the same zeal to do the things that God wants us to do? We could sure make a difference in this world, couldn't we? We had that desire, that zeal that he shows. And of course, what Jesus has done doesn't set real well with the folks there, the Jewish leaders in particular. The scripture continues, the Jews, the Jewish leaders, then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." A modern-day paraphrase of the question they ask him might sound something like this. The Jewish leaders then ask him, "Who do you think you are?" He came into the midst of their marketplace, and they're like, "Who are you to come in here and do this?" It was very lucrative business. It was a money maker. And Jesus has come in and upset things. If you want to offend, make sure that something you do offend somebody, hit them in their pocketbook, in their wallet. You hit them where they live financially, guaranteed they will get upset. And that's what he's done. The Jewish leaders ask him for a sign. They want to know what kind of authority does he have to do this, and his response is interesting. He's standing in the midst of the temple area. He tells them, "Go ahead and destroy it, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. I'll raise it up in 3 days," and they don't believe any of this. It says in verse 20, the Jews then said, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. It had taken more than 46 years to build this. Herod the Great had begun the process of rebuilding the temple, and it was mostly completed, but there were still things being done to it on the outskirts of it, on the outer edges, taking years and years and years. And Jesus says he could raise it up in 3 days. That didn't make any sense to them. And of course, as we see from John's note and explanation in verse 21, he wasn't referring to the physical temple. He was talking about his own body. Jesus has just given a promise and a prophecy of the resurrection. He has told the Jewish leaders what will happen at the end of his earthly ministry. And look at how he says it to them. It's interesting. He says, "Go ahead and destroy it." He is giving them permission to go ahead. In the case of his body, he's saying, "Go ahead and kill me." You know, Jesus did not resist when they arrested him. He did not fight. In fact, he didn't even say anything in his defense. He didn't fight it, because that was God's will for his life. That was God's plan for what he was supposed to do. He simply followed God's will as he said he would in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember those words when he is praying to the Father and he says, "Not my will, but yours." He's going to do what God has for him. And he foretells them what will happen. They will kill him, but by the power of God, he will raise himself up. He has given them and those surrounding him. He's talking to Jewish leaders. The first disciples are there with him, one of which is John. Other people that are in the area that probably watching all the excitement, and they hear that. He is telling them something that will occur. He's saying, the end of my earthly ministry, he will go to the cross willingly, and he will rise from the dead on the third day. That is the heart of the gospel message. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, and he rose again on the third day. He has told them, he has promised it. It's what it's called, a prophecy. He has told the people, here is what is going to happen. And verse 22 says, "So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the Scriptures and the word which Jesus had spoken." 3 years later, the crucifixion and the resurrection take place. And when it happens, the disciples remember back to what he had said. John tells us that when Jesus rose from the dead, they thought back to what he had said and what had been written about him, what the Scriptures had said, all of the prophecies about the Messiah. There were all kinds of prophecies about his advent. We look at that at Christmas. There were all the prophecies of what would happen during his life on earth, and that's going to come to an end. And then there's all the prophecies about what will happen on that glorious day when he returns. And it says that the disciples believed. Fulfilled prophecy is one of the greatest proofs that we can believe the things that are said here in the Scriptures and that we can believe what Jesus says. Jesus saying, on the third day I will rise again, his foretelling his resurrection means we can believe the other things he told us. All of us have our favorite things that we take that Jesus said that give us comfort. I go to prepare a place for you. I will be with you till the end. Come unto me, all you who are heavy laden. Whatever it might be, we can believe that because the resurrection occurred. It's a historical fact. We've looked at this passage this morning, so what do we see here? We're trying to find things that we can take to apply to our lives. First, we see God does not take lightly the misuse and the perversion of the things he has given us. He gave the instructions for building the temple, and it was to be a place of worship for Jews and Gentiles alike. And when it wasn't being used for that purpose, he made sure things got corrected. Jesus had a passion, a zeal for the Lord's work, and so should we. Jesus looks out for the less fortunate. Throughout his ministry, he's going to minister to the powerless, to the downtrodden, to those who have been taken advantage of. And he's going to teach us to do the same thing. He isn't pleased that the merchants and the money changers are taking advantage of the people. And he's going to set things straight. He brings some justice to the situation. And finally, Jesus foretells what will happen to him. He will go to the cross willingly in order to fulfill God's plan for his life. He will rise again on the third day. That fulfilled prophecy that happened means that all of the other promises that he has given are going to come true. We can believe those. He will come again. He will set this world right. It will happen. If he said it, we should believe it. We're going to